All right. And now I'd
Right.
like to introduce our moderator for tonight's conversation. Cami Ostman, founder of the Narrative Project, has published a memoir, Second Wind, One Woman's Midlife Quest to Run 7 Marathons on 7 continents, and has coded several anthologies, including Beyond Belief, The Secret Lives of Women in Extreme Religions, and True Stories, volumes 1 through 3. She has been profiled in Fitness Magazine, and her books have been reviewed in O Magazine, The Atlantic, and The Washington Post. And now for our featured author this evening, Laura Kalpakian is the author of 13 novels and 4 collections of short fiction. Kalpakian is the winner of an NEA Fellowship, a Pushcart Prize, a Pacific Northwest Booksellers Award, an Anahid Award for an American writer of Armenian descent, the Penn West Award, and the Stand International Short Fiction Competition. She lives in the Pacific Northwest, and she's here today to discuss her new book, Memory into Memoir, a writer's handbook. Please welcome Cami Ostman and Laura Kalpakian.
Thank you.
Thanks, Achali. Hi, Laura.
Hi, Cami. So it's good to be here.
I know, good to be here with you. Long time no see.
Oh, yes. And thank everybody for coming too. Yes.
Yes. Welcome to everybody. We can't see you, but we know you can see us.
Yes, we know you're there.
If you have questions for Laura, be sure to pop those in the Q&A button down below, because we have the chat disabled just so it's not distracting. But so Laura, I'm really excited to be able to talk to you about Memory into Memoir, because this is like a I told you so sort of book for me. So first of all, though, you have 2 books actually coming out.
Yes.
You have the Memory into Memoir, and then you have the Unruly Past.
Right.
And it's a little unusual to release 2 books at the same time. How did these books come about, and how do they work together?
Well, this one came first, and this one I had heard a friend of mine let me know that University of New Mexico Press wanted to expand their writers, books for writers, and she knew that I had this memoir course that I had been teaching for really decades, couple of 20 years probably, and among those students were people like Cami Ostman, and who had been nagging me for years to put it on the page, and I just never did. So I thought, okay, I would do this, and so I wrote a proposal which they accepted, and I thought, oh, I will just be able to take my course materials, which I'd refined over the years, and put them on the page. And of course, it did not happen that way. In the course of writing the book, of course, I use all these examples of how things, should look, and for certain techniques and so on. And I drew those examples from my fiction, from the novels and stories that I've written. And then one of the peer review people remarked, well, all these are drawn from fiction. Why aren't they from memoirs? And so early this year, while I was deep into Memory into Memoir, my friend Andrea Gabriel, who runs the Paint Creek Press, said, well, you have memoirs. Why don't you just bring them together? We'll put them in a book and publish them. Oh, that sounds good. And I also thought that I could do that swiftly and easily. And on both of these counts, I was totally wrong. Mm-hmm. So I really was writing the books I would finish the copy edit on Memory into Memoir, and then I'd go back to the draft of the Unruly Past, and kind of juggling them all the way through, because I really did want this book to come out simultaneous with Memory into Memoir. And one of the things that really quite astonished me was that when I was writing this book, putting this book together, I found that I found myself doing all the things that I suggest people don't do. And I had to go back. And so even, writing this book was a tremendous help to me in putting together my own book of memoirs. And, but it was they were both eye-opening in terms of both unique experiences for me in terms of my work. I know.
I think, you said, I used to nag you to get the exercises into a book, because all of us who've taken your classes have benefited from in fact, I mentioned to you the other day that one of the exercises that you gave us in the class, actually the writing that I did ended up in my book, Second Wind, and that was the photograph exercise. But translating, it wasn't just as simple really as taking the class and popping it into a book. And so why was that? I mean, what was the complexity there for you?
Well, the complexity was that a class is an organic thing. A class responds, and to a greater degree than I had thought, it's shaped by the people who are in that class. And everyone who's in that class, whether they're lively or quiet, whatever, they make a contribution. And that contribution cannot happen on the page. So that was remarkable to me. And also, one of the things, like when I would be, the book I put together differently than the way I would teach the class, that it had to emerge, you might say, and it had to be invitational on the page. It had to be the kind of thing that I had to create. The voice that's in that book is my voice. Yes. And it had to be just the way that you would in a class, like, you can do this, and here's how, and here's what to look for, and here's what not to do, that kind of thing. So I found that really the organizing the book was very different than putting the way I would put together the class. The class was a 3-term class, you remember. So there's like 30 weeks. So that all had to be squashed down too. And then the other thing was that I used my mom's book. My mom, I nagged her into writing her memoirs. My mom started this when she was in her 90s, and she, first she said, oh, no, I don't have anything to say. But then as I gave her these activities, these prompts and so on, she found she did have something to say. And so I relied a lot on her material as well, because I think writers can see, especially writers who are maybe not experienced writers, could see how this could grow. Yeah. And it did. And finally she published. I mean, we had a big publishing party for her book when she was 97. So
I know that was so fun.
It was a fun day
there with her book. One of the things that I was remarking about in reading Memory into Memoir, a couple of things, because I had seen an earlier version of it. You had sent me,
right?
And in the final version, you not only is your voice very present, but your story is very present. Your own story and your family story is right here in the pages. So it reads a little bit like a memoir, actually.
Yes.
It really does.
That was another thing that surprised me, is how much I put my own, it ended up being a memoir, a memoir of sorts for me, and also for my mom, that, she said when she saw the early draft of it, that, her life was there too, not just her process. But yes, I ended up putting a lot about myself and my family and so on in here. I used, I contrasted, for instance, something that I had written about local theaters with something my son Bear wrote. I got his permission to publish that. And, my son Brendan makes an appearance at the last chapter and so on. So it ended up being, as a handbook for writers, but it ended up being for me very personal.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I imagine there's some people in the audience who don't have it in their hot little hands yet. So just in terms of how it's organized, what Laura's done is she's taken different elements of what's important about writing a memoir, and has basically given us some instruction around that. And then there are exercises, and the exercises are really fun. I mean, they're really fun exercises. So I'm just curious. I know I have some favorite exercises. Do you have any favorites in here?
Well, my favorite is the one about, it's under the chapter developing character. I think that's chapter 4.
Yeah.
And I call this exercise late of this parish. And I take that quote from Great Expectations, in the opening scene of Great Expectations, where poor Pip is accosted by Magwitch, the convict, and he says to Pip, they're in the graveyard of this church, and he says to Pip, "Where are your parents?" And Pip says, "There, sir," on the tombstones, late of this parish. And so what we do in that, and I've had such great response with that, with writers, is to you write what basically an obit, and the dates and that sort of thing, who they married and that sort of thing. And then the eulogy, which is always very forgiving, very kind, very sweet. And then what I call the anti-eulogy, and which I take that from Mark Twain, when he wanted to marry Olivia Langdon, her father wanted letters of reference. And so he asked everybody who hated him worse to write. And this surprised Mr. Langdon considerably, but as Mark Twain said to him, "Now you know the worst of me." And one of those was writer Bret Hart, by the way. So, and out of all that, then you create a scene.
Right.
And in that scene, there has to be something that will tie it to the obit, something we'll see of the eulogy, and something from the anti-eulogy, because people really are this sort of mix of all. I mean, no one is a sterling personality or a sterling character, And I also talk a lot about the difference between character and personality on the page. So that's probably my favorite. And then my second favorite is the past and the present, the diary, the letter, and the journal, moving out from the self.
Yeah. I think those are, I would agree, those are my two favorites. And one thing I just want to point out, and for those of you who are watching, who are writers, which it's a lot of our audience today, one of the nice things about the exercises in Memory into Memoir is that Laura really does take you through a series of steps. So it's a progression, it's a developmental process. So you have the obituary, then you have the eulogy, then you have the anti-eulogy, and then you have a scene. Now this character, and you point out in that chapter, and I think this is such an important, I point this out a lot to the memoir writers that I work with as well. When you know someone, they live inside of your head. You don't really think about having to describe them or put them on the page.
Right.
They live in your body, and especially parents and siblings and whatnot.
Right.
But the reader isn't going to know that person.
Yeah.
Nor does the reader know the narrator either. I mean, it's hard to remember that you have to put yourself on the page as a character.
Yes.
And so I love this exercise because it really walks you through how to do that.
One of the little anecdotes that I have in Memory into Memoir is that when I went back east to graduate school, somebody there asked me, what did my mother look like? And I was at a loss. I mean, I could, she had dark hair like I had then, and dark eyes. But I realized, like, here was this person I knew so well, but I didn't even have a picture with me of my parents. But I couldn't convey it. And that's the thing about memoir, is that, and that's why I really call it Memory into Memoir. Memory is an amorphous thing that sort of flits around little bits and pieces, but a memoir is something you actually create, and you have to supply context for that reader. And ideally, generally, a memoir is written for someone unknown to the author.
Right. Yeah, right. I don't know if I ever mentioned this to you, but just as an aside with that exercise, when my dad's mother passed away, my uncle gave her eulogy, and I knew that he was going to paint her in this glowing light. And since I had done the exercise, the anti-eulogy, I decided that I would, and she was a really complicated, difficult woman. And I just thought with all of us that she had, railed against sitting in the audience, that if nobody told the truth, it would be a really painful funeral. So I wrote an anti-eulogy, which was a combination of some of the things that I knew were difficult about her in conjunction with the things I loved about her. And the minister came up afterwards and told me it was the best eulogy he'd ever heard. And I said, well, you have to give Laura Kalpakian some credit for that.
Okay.
Yeah. So I know that you taught this class, out of which this book was written, for how many, was it 30 years? I mean, you've taught this class.
No, I started this class basically in 1992 when I was the Recce writer in residence at University of Washington. And that class, I talk about that in the preface. That class was just an eye-popping experience. I mean, they were great students and great writers, and I was so demanding. I never worked so hard in all my life for the classes for that one. But then I didn't start teaching until teaching memoir until about 2000. So it was about 20 years, 15 or 20 years. And each time, I'd go back and revise my materials, and I'd try things that didn't work, and they would just go in a folder that said that didn't work,
Mm-hmm.
So I was constantly updating everything.
Yeah, I mean, I was sort of curious, what were the needs of your students that you were responding to as you were developing the material? It must have been this sort of symbiosis of like getting some writing in and seeing what they were struggling with, and then developing an exercise. How did that work?
Well, when I teach memoir, and people who've taken my class, you probably remember this, that first night that I teach it, class always met once a week for 3 hours. And I would say to people, you look around this room, because at the end of these 3 terms, there's going to be people in this room who will be your lifelong friends. Because the whole genre requires trust. Mm-hmm. It absolutely requires trust of the people who are engaged in it. And as you go along, you start to people better, and you begin to know like their past. And so who are your really good friends? They're people who know your past. Mm-hmm. And for whom you might say dimension, not just an acquaintance, but dimension. And a lot of these are these really moving stories that people bring. And so too, that's one of the reasons why like the memoir classes are much more they're just much more intimate than teaching fiction. The right. Fiction, you can always put off like over here, these are the characters and so on. And I've created these characters. They might be a stand-in for me, but they're not me.
Right.
And that's why like when I teach memoir, I'm always really careful to tell people you have to say the narrator, right. Not you or your mother or your dad or whatever, the narrator's mother, the narrator's, that kind of thing, just to kind of keep some distance there. But it really, I just love teaching. I love teaching fiction and memoir both, but memoir is really the dearest to me, because I have made out of these classes really dear, good, lifelong friends.
Yeah.
Right. Like you.
Yes. And so I mean, you were touching on something that I know you and I have talked about a lot, but the source the source of memoir is different than the source of fiction. Well, I mean, you might source something in fiction from your own life, but like you've said, the characters, they begin to take on a life of their own. Whereas
Right.
with memoir, what's happening is that you know what happened, but and I'm fond of saying that life doesn't happen in a narrative arc, but a book needs to. You have this whole like cluster of things that happened to you, and the motivation for writing might be a little bit different. It might be
Mhm.
you need to get this stuff out of your body onto the page, but
Mhm.
you still need to bring shape to it. Now
Right.
you've largely been a fiction writer through the course of your career. What for you was the difference, like in your body, the difference between
Mhm.
writing fiction and nonfiction?
For me, it was sort of like what you're saying, that even if you're taking material from your own life and you're putting it in fiction, there is a point at which in any work of fiction, certainly in a novel, I always feel like the characters kind of turn around to the author, give her the finger, and go off and do what they want. I mean, they have their own. I won't do that, and um, and so you have to release them. The other thing is that whatever anguish or pain or joy or great belly laughs or whatever it is that you put into that character, there's a way to you're removing that. You might say, using your metaphor, like out of your body and putting it over here. This person's going to experience that. In writing memoir, you can't do that really. And so writing memoir to me was very much more moving than writing a novel, even though like when I write a novel, I laugh, I cry, I do all those things. But when I'm done with a novel, I feel like I never read my work in print. I just never do, because I always want to change it and I should have done this different. And so I never read in print. But when I walk away from a novel or set of stories or something, I feel like they're a neighborhood where I used to live. And I still have affection for them. I'm still interested in what happens to them, but I don't live there anymore, and I've moved away. And for that, certainly writing this book, I could not move away.
Yeah.
And so what happens here, the first two chapters of this, the two longest chapters, it starts out with the big panoramic picture of my Armenian background, my mother's parents. And then on the other hand, we move over to my dad, who was brought up in a staunch rural Mormon community and who would never have left Idaho if it hadn't been for the Second World War. He joined the Navy. So, and then after, I had to, structuring this book was really hard for me, especially because I was writing it under such duress, and some of the transitions are kind of rickety, I have to admit, but it was quite different because whatever else, this is a neighborhood where I still live,
Yeah. Yeah, and what really struck me when I was sitting with both of the books, okay, so you've often said this about my book, Second Wind, that I was the only writer you've ever had in class who was writing a book about something that hadn't happened yet.
Hadn't happened yet, yeah.
Because I was writing about the memoirs and I still was, or sorry, the marathons, and I was still writing them. And so I was in class with a lot of people with you, and doing the exercises that are really designed for, really the exercises in here, I want everyone to know, like you can literally use the exercises in Memory and Memoir, whether you're writing a memoir or a fiction. The skills are skills, like narrative skills are narrative skills, period. So, but they're designed for you to access your memories and to turn the memory into narrative. And most of the people in the class were writing about family history, or their own personal history, things that had already happened. And I was, when I was reading The Unruly Past, then, which is your story, I thought, oh my gosh, there were writers in your family, like all the way back on both sides. People wrote, and not just journals. Yes, they were journals, but they were also writing family history for their posterity, you know? And I imagine that's true for a lot of people who have original documents, you know, from family, which you had, and some of which you used in here. One thing that I love so much is the way that you handled the use of original documents in Memory and Memoir.
Yes.
Can you say a little bit about that?
Yes. Actually, I wouldn't say there were writers in my family by any means, but there were certainly storytellers on both sides. And these stories get shaped over generations a lot of times, certainly over decades. And finally, whether they're true or not, you know, swear to Buddha true, doesn't really matter. They serve a purpose. They serve a purpose. And so I do think that you have to be careful using original documents like diaries or letters. You can't just plop those on the page. Again, because you're writing ideally for a reader unknown to the author, you have to offer up context that you otherwise don't. And so I love, in the class that Cami was in, moving out from the journal, the letter, to the memoir, I used the three little pigs, but I have something more elegant in this book.
Yes, I was looking for the three little pigs. I was like, where are the three little pigs?
The three little pigs aren't in here, but yeah, but you have, and one of the things that I do with both of them, both the Armenians and the Mormons in here, is like I bring a measure of imagination to what they have, like, and I ask questions of the past. And for me, I think that is one of the most interesting things about writing memoir, and that one discovers as one moves through the past. It's not just like, oh, I'll just slap this on the page, you know. And your readers, like in a classroom or a critique group or whatever, you know, they're gonna ask, well, what about this? And you start to see things in a new way. And you start to even see your own people in a new way. And I do think that asking questions of the past is, it can be challenging, as I say, which, and it can be moving, and it can be wistful and enigmatic. And there are some of these questions, as I well know from writing this, I'll never have answers to.
Right.
But you can use your imagination to link them and to expand a little bit and to kind of poke through the fog. And I think that using the imagination, because memory just kind of comes to you from wherever, you know, these little bits and shards, and you absolutely need to use your imagination to link them, to expand, to ask questions of the past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We have 36 people here, and I know that many of them have been in your classes, and this book is a great, I mean, truly thank you so much for writing it. And, you know, I only had to nag you for so long to get it done. But, you know, honestly, it's so wonderful for me, both as a writer and as a writing teacher, to have this gift, you know, because otherwise it's just I was constantly like, hey, can I use your exercise on blankety blank? You send it to me again, you know, and now, you know, I can just make sure that everybody has a copy of this. And I know I speak for a lot of people when I say thank you so much for this labor of love, you know, both in your teaching, but now it's here for us, you know.
Well, I do think that the focus is on memoir, but I do think that the book is useful for anybody writing.
I agree.
You know, fiction, narrative, nonfiction, memoir.
I agree 100%. We have some, I was just noticing that we have some questions in the Q&A, and some of them are interesting questions. So is it okay if we turn our attention to our audience questions. And by the way, everybody out there, if you have a question, pop it in the Q&A. Our chat is closed down so that it doesn't distract us while we're talking, but that little Q&A box is where you can jot a question down. So first of all, Elise G, hi Elise, says, congratulations, Laura. How early in the process would you allow family members to read a draft, if at all? This is such a juicy question. I have my opinions. What do you think?
It is. I would say not early. I would say not early. I mean, I have had so many, writers that I've worked with and said, they sent the draft to their sister or whatever. Oh, you're too hard on mom. She wasn't like that. It wasn't. And I am a firm believer in that truth belongs to the teller.
Yes.
And maybe it wasn't like that for her, but that the truth belongs to the teller. And I think that I think you should hang on to your draft for as long as you can, really, before you share it with somebody else, because sometimes the instinct is, oh, well, maybe I was really wrong about that. And indeed, maybe you were, maybe you need to rethink it. But I also feel that to get it on the page in a way that is comfortable for that I'm comfortable with what I've got on the page. I don't mean comfortable like it's perfect, but I'm comfortable with what I've got on the page, and I know why everything is there.
Yes.
And then part with it, not before.
I couldn't agree more, because I mean, as you know, I believe that we as writers, we go through a psychological journey, a psychological process. Mm-hmm. And if you turn that material over to someone who may have been involved in the exercise at a certain point, in the event at a certain point before you've gone through your whole psychological journey, then you can get stunted in the writing process. So yep, I couldn't agree more. So Dana asks, Laura, what do you think memoir writers most misunderstand about the process of writing memoir? That's a good question. What do you think most memoir or wannabe memoir writers most misunderstand about writing a memoir?
I think just that, I can just put this on the page.
Yeah.
I can just put this on the page and there it will be. And that I can put this on the page without asking questions of the past.
Right.
And I just think the process of writing itself obliges you to ask questions of the past and to fill in the context and to develop and use your imagination in a way that will surprise you.
Yeah.
I mean, I have worked with so many, writers who they have these wonderful stories, but the story just kind of floats out here. You know what I mean?
Right.
And then you say, well, how were you? Why were you there? Or how did you come to be there? Or and then there's a story behind the story behind the story, and that's a lot of times what gets excavated. Mm-hmm. And I do think that's the correct verb, to excavate the past. Right. That it's not just. You do have to do a little digging around and dusting off and that kind of thing. And that that's why I really believe that imagination and memory work together to create memoir. And I think a lot of people who write memoir think, I don't need my imagination. I just use what I remember, put it on the page. And that just isn't going to happen.
Well, no, because what we remember doesn't necessarily all link together. It's the right. Imagination. It's those are the sinews right. and the muscles that hold all the right. bones together, right?
Yeah, yeah. And a lot of times too, it's like, people say, "Well, these are my memoirs here," but it's really not. I mean, it's just like we ate this. I mean, that's one of the things I always say. I had my mom when she was so reluctant to write. I said, okay, we'll start with the addresses. You can remember the addresses that you had. Her family, from the time they arrived in Los Angeles, till they moved to the place where they lived forever, was they had 5 different addresses. And my mom started with the address, and she would just, and then she began to write. Yes, all the stuff. That's the other thing. The more you write, the more it comes back to you. You remember stuff you didn't know you had even forgotten.
Yeah.
My mom put in little anecdotes and stuff in her book, which she called Centennial Memoir, that she had never told us, these charming little stories, and they just kind of bubble up. And so that's the other thing that I think will really surprise any writer who picks up the pen to write a memoir, that there will be so much more that will come to you that you had no idea was there,
Yeah, remember that when I interviewed your mom about her book, and so it was after the book was actually even published, and
yes,
my slant to the interview was like, it's really never too late, right? Because by the time I interviewed her, it was the next year, she was 98, I think. And
that's right. Yeah.
And she had even just before our interview, she had remembered this Bible quote.
Right.
Honor your mother. Well, she was so touched by that connection.
Let me tell you this little story, and my family who's listening here, you know how much this will mean. My mom's still alive. She's living in a nursing home. She's 99. But about a year after she published this memoir, which she called Centennial Memoir, because she started it in 2017, and her parents had married in the old country in 1917. And the thing is a colon, a tribute to my parents. And this Bible quote comes to her like out of nowhere, honor thy father and mother so that something will return to you after many days. I don't remember the exact quote, but she looked it up and it was there. It was in Exodus. And it came to her she was not a biblical scholar or anything like that. It just came to her with such force, like, this is what I've done. Honor thy father and mother. This is what I've achieved. And it was just before you interviewed her that this came to her. And now my mom's working on a second edition on volume 2, and that's going to be the opening chapter.
Yeah,
it's coming on that. And that really, the book was out, and
but it's such a good example of how, as you write, as you engage with your memory, the meaning comes to you.
The meaning comes out, and the meaning comes out in ways that will surprise you. I mean, you think, oh, it's my past. I know. But even like writing this, I saw connections in my own young life that I had never noticed. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I had never until I put them here on the page. And I didn't even put them all here. I just noticed them,
Right.
So yeah, it's really quite a wonderful process, I think. And I mean, I love writing fiction, and as you say, that's what I've done my whole career. But this was really quite an unforgettable experience. Both of these books were, and both of them I thought, oh, I'm a skilled writer. I work hard every day. I can do this swiftly and it won't surprise me. And I was totally wrong.
Oh, it's good to know that something can still kick your ass, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. I mean, it was really, I was unprepared really for as much as I laughed and cried and struggled with. I mean, that's the other thing with fiction. You have a general notion like, okay, I am going to start these characters out here, and then I'm probably going to end them up over here somewhere. Maybe you don't know exactly, but and you can maneuver them. And as I said, there's a point at which, in the writing of certainly of a novel, that these characters gain a kind of autonomy. I know that sounds weird, but it's true. But the narrator of the memoir, he or she doesn't have autonomy.
Right.
you know, and you can't be saying, well, I'd really rather you go over here. You know what I mean? No, you have to wrestle with it. So
there's some questions here about the comparing the writing of memoir to the writing of a novel. And Nancy Tepper has a question if we're going to get to hear Laura read an excerpt. Yes, we are, Nancy. Don't
okay.
fret. So Linda Lambert, asks how did either or both of these books compare in speed or of composition with your novel? And then Susan Chase Foster asks, which gives you more joy, writing memoir or fiction? And I don't know if you can answer those two together or if they're totally different questions.
I mean, I wouldn't be able to say that one was more joyous than the other, because I have this belief, and from many years of writing, that if you don't laugh and you don't cry, how can you expect the reader to laugh or cry? If you are not really engaged with your material. And I mean, I know there are some writers who, they map everything out and then they just go in and write it. I don't ever work like that. I mean, when I write, I have to go upstairs and I just kind of put on my seatbelt every day and say, where is this material going to take me? Certainly that's true with a novel. Where is it going to take me? I don't know. I had more of a grip of where it was going to take me with these two books. And the challenge with these two books was the structure. Mm-hmm. That I moved the structure all around, with both of them. And then finally, that once I got the structure, then I had to go back and revise everything so it would fit that structure. Mm-hmm. So, I really feel that they're allied. As I said, to me, the difference is that the memoir is a neighborhood I can't leave.
Right.
And for instance, I'm doing a Zoom book club for the Great Pretenders later on this month with a friend from who used to live in California with me. And
which parenthetically, let's just say for anybody who doesn't know, that the Great Pretenders was your most recently released new novel.
Yes. Right. And was released in 2019. And it's a Hollywood novel about the blacklist. And I thought, I'm gonna, she sent me some questions and so on. I go, oh, I'm gonna have to relook at this, because I mean, it was only 2 years ago and I worked on it for a long time. And but it was a neighborhood I have in my head and my heart. I have left it, but I signed several copies of it there today at Village Book. So that was nice to know they're still carrying it.
Right. Sort of getting back to Linda's question. How did either or both of these books compare in speed of composition to your novels? I sort of wanted to add an additional question to that. When you have a deadline, you had deadlines for both of these books. Yes. And for Great Pretenders.
Right.
I have observed you as a writer, and my guess to my answer to that question, Linda, and we'll see if I'm right about this, is that if there's a deadline, Laura will finish it faster. And if there's no deadline, she'll keep dinking away at it forever. But maybe I'm wrong. Right. You tell me.
No, that's absolutely true. I mean, I am one of those writers that there's this great story about Balzac, and he would write his books and then they would send them to the printers and then they would print it and they would send it back to him to proof it. But he would have never proof it. He would he'd go over here, he writes more, he'd change this, he'd go, and then he'd send it back and the printer would do the same thing. And, and finally they just quit sending it to him. You just don't get to see it anymore, you know? and so that's why, I tinkered with things like over 10 years, you know what I mean? Back and forth. These books, both of them did have deadlines and I did meet them.
Well, that being said, the Unruly Past, some of these essays you had started long time ago. I mean,
yes,
right?
Yes. And that was the other thing. Like, I thought I could just pop them on the page, but I couldn't. And actually, I ended up not even using many of the ones I thought I would. They were okay when I wrote them, but they didn't age well. And a couple of them I'd taken from speeches where, I'd gone on and over here and over here. And you can do that in a speech, but it don't work on the page, that kind of thing. And so I ended up really, with the exception of the very first essay in here, the declarations and denials, I really had to create everything else from scratch.
Yeah.
But for the exception of the first and the last, really.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah. Couple of other questions here. Elise says, thank you. Yes. Nice to have you here. And Cheryl McCarthy says that your class changed her life.
oh, nice.
Will you teach another memoir class in Bellingham because you're making her want to write another memoir? What is your writing work schedule look like? How many days per week? What does your writing life look
I
like?
write every morning.
Yeah.
I get up, and the older I get, the more I get just like habit, I go upstairs and it's like I'm like a little robot driven to the desk. And so I write best in the morning. And so I don't do anything else except work in the morning. And anything else I'm going to have to do has to happen in the afternoon, usually after 3, because I'm brain dead by then anyway.
Yeah.
But I got into that pattern when my kids were in school, and they would go to school really early, and I would somebody once asked me a question like, well, what about the breakfast dishes? And I said, what breakfast dishes? So what? They're going to stay there. I'm going to go to work.
Yeah.
And I still kept to that. So anything else I do in the afternoon.
I know if I've ever called you in the morning and you've answered the phone, it always seems to me like you're coming out of another world. Hello, what's happening? Why is someone calling?
Yeah, that's really true. I don't like to talk on the phone in the morning.
I don't call you in the mornings anymore. Janet says she liked the French quote at the beginning of Unruly Past. Is it a favorite quote? Why did you choose it? The one that starts pour toute la famille. I won't read the rest of it because I'll embarrass myself. But.
Actually, I wrote that myself.
Okay.
And what it says is, for all the family, for those who are near and those who are far, for those who are living and those who are dead, for those who have been lost and those who have been found, and those who have not yet been born. Now, I have 2 little granddaughters who I hope will read these and know their families. And then there's, most everybody in here, certainly in the first 2 chapters, the one about the Armenians and the Mormons, my mom, and then there's a cousin in France. They're the last of that generation. But I will say that of the Armenians here, 100 years passed before we all reconnected. After, it was really November of 1921, is based, as I can see, that my grandparents were loaded on cattle cars and taken to Syria. But who knows why or what. And then just this month in Paris, cousins of mine, distant cousins from Glendale were visiting, were in Europe, and they all got together, and 100 years have passed. So I really felt like I wanted this book not to be just for any one person, but to be for the dead and the living, and the others who may yet come. I wrote the poem, but my cousin who teaches French, she finessed it. So yeah, I didn't do the finessing. She did that.
Well, I love the Unruly Past because of the gift I think that it is to family. And, I'm a family therapist by trade. And just last night I was at a friend's house and they were talking about their family. And I said, the family therapist, we use this thing called a genogram to help keep track of everybody. And I had been reading your book and I said, wait, hold on, go get me a piece of paper. And I just drew out the genogram of this friend's family. His cousin was there. and they were both taking pictures of it and pulling up images from their family. And I was just thinking about how amazing and wonderful it is to have a volume of the narrative of the family. I mean, because so often it's just hard to even remember who's who's
Who's
related
who,
to
yeah.
who, you know, and so it's just so
Yes.
lovely, and what a gift to everyone to have this unruly
Yeah.
past. And I hope that people will pick up both volumes, because they really are companion volumes.
They really are companion volumes. And this one, in fact, after the copy editor, who's a local woman named Virginia Herrick, after she went through, she sent me a list of the names, and I thought, oh my God, look at all this, you know. And she was the one who suggested that I do something there at the back, so people, if you wouldn't get lost, you know.
That's really smart.
So
you do have a reading for us, don't you?
I do. I have a little petite reading that I took from the preface that I wrote this preface firstly because Cami suggested I write a preface, because I just leapt into the book. And then I went back and I had to redo the preface when, as I said, the peer review came back, and one of the people who had reviewed the book was kind of annoyed, I think is the word, that it wasn't more knuckles and know-how. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And it was never intended to be that. So then I rewrote it in it. And this is from the preface to Memory into Memoir. Both memoir and fiction rely on imagination. Writing a memoir is not simply an act of preservation, but an act of invention, because the fabric of the past is never clean, hemmed, pressed, folded, and stacked chronologically. The past comes to us in fragments, finished off by imagination. Indeed, memoir best flourishes at the confluence of memory and imagination. Memory calls on imagination to mend the ragged ends, to create continuity over the frayed parts. In transforming amorphous memory into narrative memoir, the writer puts a literary structure over the past, hoping to both capture and evoke, one act propelling the other. This is the writing process, that is to say, the canopy concept over this book. Memory into Memoir is less of an IKEA how to assemble manual and more of an invitation to reimagine the past in writing, to rethink, revisit memory in prose. Memory into Memoir explores the process of placing narrative form over the unruly past. Prose does not spring onto the printed page like Venus on the half shell. Writing is a process of growth and change and discovery. And as I learned all those years ago in grad school, I'm still firmly believe good writing is good writing, no matter the form. Memoir, fiction, nonfiction, narrative prose of any sort use the same tools: narration, dialogue, scenic depiction, dramatic arc, character development, vivid language. Memoir writers can learn from fiction, and fiction writers can profit from memoir. The materials you will find in this book, though specific to memoir, can be used by any writer. As I now read and reread and revise and rethink what I have written, I see my own past plays a role here, making Memory into Memoir also a personal memoir of sorts. I've dedicated this book to my mother, Peggy Kalpakian Johnson, and followed her writing process in these pages because it is illustrative for other writers. She wrote her memoir in her 90s and finished it when she was 97. Please consider this book an invitation to pick up the pen. Think of that pen as an oar as you get in your little narrative boat and paddle towards the past.
Very nice.
Yeah.
Very nice. Well, just one last comment and then one last question for you, Laura.
Okay.
Comment is from Helen Johnson, someone I think you know, and from your sister. She says that she loves the organization of Memory into Memoir. So fans even in the family. That's good. That's good news.
Yes, yes.
And then we had a question from Cheryl, and there's another one from Christy here about your teaching. And so are you planning, this is kind of putting you on the spot, are you planning on teaching any more memoirs, some novels, some general narrative? What's on the horizon?
I don't have any immediate plans to do that. I wouldn't be averse to it.
Yeah.
Especially once people can go back into the classroom.
Yeah.
Because I really like I like the camaraderie, and I'd even say kind of the combustion of the classroom. I really enjoy that, and I really like to see. I think that students, when they come, they bring something to it. So, when we can all go back in the classroom again, I would love to teach
do
again.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I would love that for you. I think that's combustion is a great word. There's a lot of energy in Laura's classes. There's just a dynamism in there. So, and I do think that dynamism comes through. It is a different thing to have it in a book than in a class. But I do think it comes through. So again, thank you so much for that, Laura.
Thank you. Yeah.
Gift. Yeah. And I think Village Books is going to jump back on here with us. And
sorry, my video was taking a second.
Ollie.
Yes, well, thank you, Cami, and thank you, Laura.
Thank you, everybody.
Outstanding conversation. And thank you to the audience for joining us today. We always appreciate having you. And give me a moment, please. All right. I just sent the link in the chat for you guys. You can purchase Memory into Memoir if you do not have a copy already from the link I sent to the Village Books website. You may also rewatch this event on the Village Books YouTube channel if you would like, and that will be posted in a day or two. You can also send it to people who might have not been able to make it that you know. Cami and Laura, you made this so easy. You guys are professionals, so thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming.
Yes, great, everybody.
Thank you, Cami. It was great talking to you.
So fun to talk about writing again.
Yeah, about writing, yeah.
All right. Do you guys have any final words at all?
I do have one thing I want to say, which is that if people who are on this call, they're writers, I really recommend that you follow Laura's blog at laurakalpakian.com. I think, when Laura blogs, she's a smart blogger. And so it's not weekly, it doesn't come into your inbox on a she's not going to pester you, but her blogs are smart, and I think she's well worth following. So jump on there, and then you can keep your eyes peeled for her next books, because some of her older books are coming out again. They're being relaunched.
Yes. Oh, I would say that Paint Creek Press has reissued These Latter Days and Dark Continent. And in fact, Village Books has one copy of These Latter Days. And that really was, as I see it now, looking back, the seminal book of mine, from which everything else kind of evolved, Okay, thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming.
I do have one more thing to add. If you ordered the book online with your ticket to the event, I believe those ones were signed also, and they'll be on their way in the mail.
Yes, they've all been signed.
Great.
All right.
All right.
Well, thank you, everyone, and have a great evening.
Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Night.
All right. Cheers. Bye.